Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, this touchpad is. Okay. Sorry, just can't really see the screen. Oh, it'll go. Yeah, I can't. Sorry, it'll go away. Okay. Welcome to our colleagues and friends here in the CAARI Library and online, and thank you for joining us for our lecture series. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Leilani Lucas, here at CAARI as the recipient of a CAARI-CAORC Fellowship, generously funded by the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. I would also like to take this opportunity to announce to our audience that CAARI Fellowships are now open and for applications for next year, so please take a look at our website at caari.org to see the opportunities we offer. Leilani Lucas undertook her MA in her home city of Las Vegas at the University of Nevada, studying with Professor Alan Simmons. She then moved to University College London and was awarded her PhD in archaeology in 2012 with a dissertation entitled Economy and Interaction, Exploring Archaeobotanical Contributions in Prehistoric Cyprus. This was published as a monograph, Crops, Culture and Contact in Prehistoric Cyprus in 2014. Following her doctoral award, she was an ERC postdoctoral research associate on the Comparative Pathways to Agriculture project with Professor Dorian Fuller, also at UCL. Leilani's current position is Community College Professor of Anthropology at the College of Southern Nevada, where she has worked since 2017. Professor Lucas is author or co-author of over 20 articles on archaeobotanical remains, ranging from Cyprus to Iraqi Kurdistan to Las Vegas and a castle in Scotland. Leilani has a truly global perspective and has worked on multiple assemblages from Africa, the Near East, Southeast and Southwest Asia, as well as the Mediterranean and the United States of America. Her expertise lies in the transition to agriculture and culinary practices in the Eastern Mediterranean, and her current research in Cyprus focuses on the integration of archaeobotanical data with other lines of evidence in order to shed light on the impacts of agricultural production in prehistory. Leilani has extensive field experience on Cyprus, having worked at Iasiochus with Alan Simmons, Susku Laona Settlement with Eddie Peltenberg, Prastio Meserotsas with Andrew McCarthy, and with me at Kissonerga-Skalia. She has generously trained generations of students at these projects in archaeobotanical field methods. Having known Leilani for so many years, I'm sure we're in for an exciting archaeobot journey this evening. I would now like to invite Professor Lucas to present her lecture entitled Tracing the Evolution of Culinary Traditions in Prehistoric Cyprus, Integrating Archaeobotanical and Archaeological Evidence. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Lindy, for that introduction and for inviting me tonight, and to CAARI for being such great hosts. So I'm beyond excited to share some of my recent research on the culinary traditions of prehistoric Cyprus. In the past decade, new methodologies in the analysis of charred food remains have advanced research into past culinary practices. These approaches are what inspired my current research. Tonight, I will investigate the evolution of culinary traditions through a combined analysis of the archaeobotanical and archaeological evidence. I present the framework and results from my initial investigations, including a revised interpretation of the macro remains from the island's southwest. So Lindy pretty much covered all of the beginning of that. What I will skip to is that this year I received the CAARI-CAORC Research Fellowship, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to explore a topic that I originally set out over 12 years ago. Okay, so whilst preparing for this presentation, I was revisiting some of my PhD thesis and results, and I came across a section in my introduction that I honestly forgot I had written. And we all know that the archaeological evidence of prehistoric Cyprus differs in many respects from the cultures of the contemporary mainland. These differences are evident in so many ways, including the timing of the introduction of cooking vessels and the appearance of ovens. The question I posed was, if the evidence demonstrates that Cyprus deviated from the mainland trajectory during the PP&B, does it also show a divergence in food culture as well? I stated in the introduction that I would address this question in my dissertation, and I did somewhat. But now I know that I did not address it completely. There's so much more that needs to be done than simply stating that pottery was delayed in ovens too. In a lot of ways, I needed some key methodological advancements in the field of archaeobotany to progress before I could really answer this question. But first, let's start at the very, very beginning. It has been argued that cooking made us human. Although controversial, Rangin's cooking hypothesis suggests that cooking fundamentally shaped human evolution. By cooking food, early humans were able to extract more energy, leading to biological changes such as smaller guts and larger brains. Critics of the hypothesis argue against both the early evidence of cooking, beginning with Homo erectus, as well as the difference in calorie absorption from raw to cook. They argue the biological changes were a result in a shift rather to increased meat consumption, no matter how the meat was prepared. However far back controlled fire and cooking go in our lineage, I would like to highlight the significance of cooking. For Homo sapiens, it is intricately and deeply tied to culture. We are the only species on the planet that cooks our food in culturally determined ways. Rangin states that the transformative moment that gave rise to the genus Homo, one of the great transitions in the history of life, stemmed from the control of fire and the advent of cooked meals. Cooking increased the value of our food. It changed our bodies, our brains, our use of time, and our social lives. The sharing of meals and the earliest construction of these culinary practices lie at the heart of what truly makes us human. It is not simply about bioaccessibility. It also encompasses the evolution of food culture itself. The act of food preparation has led to cultural adaptations that have, over time, shaped the diverse foodways we see today. Thus, cooking is not just a biological necessity, it is a cultural expression that defines communities and regions. Quite simply put, food is fundamentally cultural and incidentally a caloric requirement. It is culturally constructed with different techniques of cooking and preparation practices characterizing regional and chronological cultures. And like all human-made artifacts, food is not isolated because it depends on humans for its creation. Further, all forms of food production, procurement, preparation, consumption represent examples of the dependence on a variety of things, and those variety of things on people. In 2011, Ian Hodder provided cereals, wheat in particular, as a great example of the human thing entanglement. Although the analogy of a spider's web doesn't accurately depict the sometimes fragile yet dynamic and definitely evolving nature of entanglement, it provides a way to understand the evolutionary relationships between humans and things, whether domesticated plants or the human-made artifacts that get tangled into a system with them. So I agree that cereals illustrate a mutual dependency with humans, a unique relationship that has shaped the course of human history. As we begin to rely more on cereals, our diets changed, leading to a need to increase labor in planting, harvesting, and processing those cereals. All of these human actions result in additional artifacts that then get trapped into the web. This dependency on cereals resulted in biological changes, including domestication traits that made the plants reliant on humans for propagation. Conversely, over time, humans become dependent on wheat as a staple food source, shaping their agricultural practices, settlement patterns, and social structures around its cultivation. This mutual dependency thus exemplifies the concept of entanglement, where the existence and development of both humans and wheat as a crop are intricately linked and co-evolve over time. Gonzalez and Fuller recently discussed this entanglement with regards to food culture too, and cooking culture. The relationship extends to food processing as well. The cereals were sometimes ground into flour, which enhanced the caloric yield from grain and improved agricultural productivity. Further, the growing preference for cereal-based foods like bread or porridge provided a cultural push for increased human labor in the tools necessary for their production, like ovens and cooking vessels. This only helped grow the taste for cereal-based foods, which reinforced the motivation for the increased labor associated with all the things attached to the web or the human thing entanglement. But what am I actually investigating? My title says that I will trace the evolution of culinary traditions in prehistoric Cyprus by integrating the archaeological and the archaeobotanical evidence. But what is a culinary tradition exactly? I think it would be really helpful to define some terms that are often conflated in the literature and that I will be using going forward, like subsistence, cuisine, culinary tradition, and foodways. First, subsistence refers to the primary method by which a group acquires food, whether through hunting and gathering, agriculture, or fishing. We often refer to this as mode of subsistence. Although the mode of subsistence will be discussed to provide occasional insight into food acquisition, it is not the primary focus of this research, but it obviously ties into the spread of crops, for instance. Cuisine is about what people ate. It describes how specific foods are prepared and cooked, including methods like roasting and boiling. It's not just about sustenance, but reflects regional identity, local ingredients, and cultural practices. As Paris notes, cuisine can be diagnostic of a region, telling us a lot about local traditions and beliefs. And it's as Fuller and Rollins in 2011 first described as the specific dishes and flavors of a region. There are multiple lines of direct and indirect evidence that are used in archaeology, including evidence of cooking methods like roasting, indirect heat baking, hot boiling, chemical signatures of food residues, and indirectly from cooking culture and cooking equipment, or inferred cooking equipment. Culinary traditions, simply put, are the methods and the cultural practices of that food preparation. And finally, foodways are the broader cultural systems surrounding food, everything from production and preparation to serving, consumption, and disposal. It encompasses the rules, the activities, and the meanings tied to food within a culture. So it encompasses not only what people ate and why, but also how food systems shape and influence social organization. Foodways is essentially the umbrella term for a group's food culture. Instead of tracing the entire evolutionary history of culinary traditions in Cyprus, quite ambitious, I will provide the framework for how I will approach my interdisciplinary research going forward, and how I will explore both prehistoric culinary traditions and regional cuisines. I will also discuss an interesting example from the island Southwest, which kind of took me by surprise. To address this intersection between culinary tradition and cuisine, I will frame it based on Fuller and Champion's 2023 schematic representation of post-harvest processing. This is essentially the stages between collection of a natural foodstuff, number one, and its conversion to a cultural food at the end. This is distinct from the mode of subsistence. So how the food was acquired, whether it was hunted, gathered, or foraged, is not taken into consideration in discussions of these types of labor intensifications. But you may ask yourself, why should we care about labor intensification post-harvest? Essentially, it involves the human thing entanglement, or the web of connections discussed previously between increasing labor into the production of culturally edible foods with the desired cuisine and dependent culinary tradition. I believe this is an extremely valuable way to understand the evolution of culinary traditions and foodways, and further, it possibly explains the diversity of crop choices and the evolution of cooking technologies or equipment. Fuller and Champion's schematic outlines 4 stages of labor intensification and processing that occurs before cooking, including 2 potential aspects of intensification: labor processing and what they call materialesque intensification, number 4. So labor processing 2, materialesque 4. They argue that the total degree of post-harvest intensification in the creation of food is the sum of 2 and 4. I have added another stage, 5, for artifacts that are also created before cooking, but rather than being used during the cooking process, like cooking equipment, 4, the artifacts are used for consumption and performed and displayed after cooking. I believe the artifacts of consumption are also tied into this web of connections, driving cultural change in culinary traditions and crop choice. Fuller and Champion's schematic, along with my addition, outline a lot of potential artifacts and installations that can be entangled with the intensification of food processing and consumption, from grinding tools to hearths for roasting, to pottery for boiling and serving, and metal vessels for frying. Understanding the evidence for each of these stages from Cyprus and then connecting them with the archaeobotanical data is the real challenge. I will no doubt come back to the schematic, but it's been almost 10 minutes and I haven't discussed Cyprus or the archaeobotanical evidence, so we should move on. So since the completion of my PhD and subsequent bar publication in 2014, there have been several additions to the Cypriot archaeobotanical record, including really exciting data from Clemenus, Alhambra, Palasoltinteke, Trulia, Paleocastro, and new but yet unpublished data from Kirikatia. So far, there are about 36 sites representing 72 phases with 45,000 or over 45,000 charred plant remains recovered from the island. Tonight, however, I would like to focus on the data from the Southwest. But first, let us look at the island-wide data. Represented in this funnel chart are the top 20 sites with charred plant remains. This represents 88% of the total identifiable remains from everywhere on the island. I have highlighted in green 8 of the 9 phases that I will be discussing in more detail from the island's southwest coast. And as you can see, they're pretty much all in the top 20. And what are the most important plant remains from 88% of the sites? Well, this is the breakdown of the top taxa from 90% of all charred plant remains, which total over 35,000 items. I've highlighted the founder crops in orange. However, what should and should not constitute a founder crop of Neolithic agriculture and what should and should not constitute agricultural reliance are currently being debated. But nonetheless, I have highlighted these in orange because they are known food resources. Essentially, the history of the terminology surrounding founder crops suggests that they're the most ubiquitous and presumably formed a package when they spread. However, data from the last 20 years has shown both not to be true. So if we widen our focus beyond the founder crop species, then we might move closer to understanding human subsistence during the transition to agricultural reliance a little better. Please note that I have removed field bromwell as well. It's an arable weed, and most of the finds in Cyprus are biomineralized and not charged, and so they could be arguably intrusive. So I haven't included it here, but it ranks quite high. The other point regarding a focus on those select founder crops is it misses all the numerous and ubiquitous plants that are also edible. This is the same funnel chart with the top taxa in Cyprus. I additionally highlighted in a lighter orange color the likely edible plants, some of which can be arable weeds, but also edible nuts, fruits, pulses, and grasses. The exception is Fumaria offensialis, which is an arable weed of cultivation, and to my knowledge is not used as a food resource anywhere. One surprising genera of grasses is Lilium, which makes it on the top 4. And if we exclude all of the indeterminate grasses, so grasses that cannot are so poorly charred or badly charred that they couldn't be identified, it's nearly tied third with lentil. Overall, I think this gives us a pretty good idea of what plants they were possibly likely eating. Obviously, there are countless missing foods that do not make their way to the archaeobotanical record for a number of reasons, including differential preservation, differential processing techniques, the anatomy of the plant, the likelihood of it surviving or being charred in the first place, and the chances of it being recovered in the archaeobotanical sample. With that said, I think this gets us pretty close or as close as we can with the charred macro remains to understanding the top edible species and top arable weeds, or in this case, the top weed. So going back to our labor intensification schematic, we now have some information for number one, or at least what was collected and harvested most island-wide. In terms of mode of subsistence, we can see some are known domestic crops like gloom wheats, lentil, fig, and later olive, along with other plants that were gathered during this time like terebinth and hackberry. But now I will return to an overview of the archaeobotany of the Southwest in particular. So unsurprisingly, 37.5% of all published archaeobotanical data from Cyprus comes from this cluster of sites in the Southwest, namely Kissonerga-Skalia, Kissonerga-Neolithic, Kissonerga-Masfilia, and Limba-Lacus. I've only included published data from these 10 phases, and this bar chart shows the number of samples processed for each phase. I'm currently in the process of analyzing additional data from Skalia and plan to publish those results soon, but have excluded the newest from this analysis. As you can see, there's an obvious overrepresentation from the later phases of Kissonerga-Masfilia and at Kissonerga-Skalia. And to this level, to level this disparity a bit, I have lumped the data according to cultural phases. It is important to highlight that all 4 sites were processed and analyzed in the same way. Sue College was the analyst for Limba and Chalcolithic Masfilia, and Mary Ann Murray was the archaeobotanist for Masfilia. And Sue also, not only did Sue College train me, but she also trained Mary Ann Murray. So I'm pretty sure they were all processed in the same way. So here's a bar chart that shows the volume and number of items for the groupings used in this analysis. Obviously, there are loads more identifiable items for the Middle Chalcolithic and Late Chalcolithic, which could be a result of increased volume sizes, but also there appears to be more than would be expected in the Chalcolithic overall. In the following diachronic and comparative analysis, I will use the relative proportions instead of complete counts. And here we have 2 funnel charts depicting the top taxa for 2 categories. On the left are the known crops plus lullium, and on the right are the fruits and nuts. This is for all the Southwest sites together with a total of 16,873 items, representing 82% of the assemblage. Again, nothing surprising for the island of Cyprus here, except for, of course, lullium, which is highlighted in green. You may ask, why in the world has she included lullium in the list of crops? Surely it is a weed of cultivation. Or is it? So when the data is separated across time, we see some interesting patterns. 4 things stand out to me. There's a massive increase in lullium from the early PP&B to the late PP&B, which pretty much continues until the Filia. There appears to be a huge decrease in barley from the early PP&B to the late PP&B, which again continues pretty much into the Middle Chalcolithic. Lentil increases only after the Neolithic, and gloom wheats decrease in incidence from the Middle Chalcolithic. So essentially, gloom wheats are ubiquitous until the Late Chalcolithic. Lullium is everywhere from the late PP&B onwards. Lentil becomes possibly more important from the early Chalcolithic, and barley is barely a thing after the early pre-pottery Neolithic, but possibly more so from the Middle Chalcolithic. What about the pulses and flax? These together represent only 2.9% of the whole assemblage. The exception is obviously the lentil, which makes up 20%, 18.5% of which comes from the Middle Chalcolithic alone. Because it is so high, I've excluded it from this chart so I can look into more detail at the remaining 3%. Another thing that stands out is that there's diversification in pulses during the Middle Chalcolithic, with evidence for chickpea, flax, and bitter vetch. There is a continued use of flax throughout all time periods, but I would imagine that the earlier finds of flax are due to the exploitation as an oily seed as opposed to a fiber crop. One could argue for the possibility of the introduction of the fiber crop in the Chalcolithic and there is some evidence of evolutionary differentiation in terms of flax domestication from an oily food crop to a fiber crop beginning around 4000 BC. So what can we say about the fruits and nuts? Again, we see this diversification beginning in the Chalcolithic that really expands by the Middle Chalcolithic. We can see that fig increases from the late PP&B onwards. Terebinth establishes itself as an important resource early on and continues in some way until today. I think this gives us a pretty good picture of the proportions of different species, and I think that we've seen enough of bar charts and funnel charts for the moment. I would like to go slightly off topic for a minute, but I promise to tie it all together at the end. Darnall and its near relative ergot dance through history like the frenzied grinning skeletons that they are. The traditional symbolic representations, spiritual and literary sources caution about the agricultural, religious, and socio-political hazards of allowing the weed to insinuate itself into the food chain. On the other hand, from the time of the earliest agricultural societies, traditions abound that have embraced deliberate administration of darnall as a medicine or a means of achieving altered consciousness. Cambaresi has written on the unexpected artificial paradises that were opened up to the undernourished and starving through the intentional consumption of dazed bread in pre-industrial Europe. Lolium is a genus of Western Eurasian temperate or Mediterranean grasses. There are two taxa that appear to have evolved during the Near Eastern early Neolithic as obligate weeds, Lolium remotum and Lolium temelutum, which is known as darnall, which both likely have evolved out of Lolium persicum, or perhaps an ancestor of all three. Historically, it has occasionally been infested with a fungal endophyte, like ergot fungi, which produce alkaloids that can be toxic to humans and animals. The fungus infects the seeds, and these infected seeds can cause food poisoning or ergot poisoning if consumed. Symptoms of darnall poisoning include dizziness, nausea, tremors, and even death in severe cases. However, without the fungal contamination, the seeds of Lolium are not toxic. It is known as the Great Pretender, or wheat's evil twin, and it is a genus of a grass and a genius of a grass. It is also referred to as ryegrass, poison ryegrass, or darnall. It is referred to as the Great Pretender because it resembles wheat and piggybacked its way into cultivated fields and into the human food and booze. It is a mimic weed of cereal crops, and it is almost entirely reliant on humans for propagation and continued existence. The term temulentum derives from the Latin word temulentus, which means drunk or intoxicated. This name was likely given to darnall because when the seeds are consumed and contaminated, only when they are, with toxic fungi, they are known to cause dizziness, drunkenness symptoms, confusion, and loss of coordination. These seeds could sinisterly make their way into bread or beer, or perhaps purposely included. In Thomas et al.'s paper, they review historical accounts of intentional ingestion of darnall for this purpose. My favorite quote from that 2023 paper is one from a Mr. Cooper in 1565. Lolium, if consumed in hoti bread, maketh thee heady giddy. Hoti bread being the bread that was contaminated by fungi-infected Lolium seeds that intentionally, mysteriously, or accidentally made their way into dough. One of the most famous historical cases of the fungus-infected bread comes from Salem, Massachusetts in the late 1600s. In this case, ergot fungus possibly infected rye grains that were used to make bread. The infected grains produce hallucinogenic alkaloids similar to LSD, causing symptoms like hallucinations, convulsions, and paranoia. As we all know, they were misinterpreted as witchcraft and led to the execution of over 20 women, or death of over 20 women. Sorry, it's back to the archaeobotany now. So how did it all start? There are two taxa that appear to have evolved during the Near Eastern early Neolithic as obligate weeds, Lolium remotum and Lolium temulentum, which both likely evolved out of Lolium persicum. Lolium perenne is an annual, and it's a very successful as an arable weed. Remotum and temulentum are interfertile and probably evolved from persicum, another successful arable weed. Tentulentum is primarily an arable weed of cereals, mostly wheat, and remotum is primarily a weed of flax and very rarely other crops. But only remotum and temulentum are regarded as the poisonous ones because of increased susceptibility to fungal infections. However, remember, the fungus infects the seeds, and these infected seeds are the problem that can make it the heady, giddy, or the body deady. So here's a compilation of drawings from the archaeological record showing the different species. Temulentum dates to about 7100 BC at Ras Shamra in the Levant, and it becomes more widespread over the course of the Neolithic, but not as part of the initial Neolithic dispersal. Earlier finds would have likely been perenne or maybe rigitum or remotum or a mix of all of these. And there is even early evidence of genus level Lolium in the PPNA at Chiloncambros. Later finds of Lolium in Cyprus have only been identified to genus level with a couple likely species level identifications from Cape Andreas Castros, perhaps perenne, Lemba, either perenne or rigitum at Apliki and Helicotane Teke, and at Kissonerga-Skalia. Marianne Murray argues for the presence of multiple species. And I should state that 52% of all species of Lolium from the island comes from Kissonerga-Skalia. Regarding the evidence from Cyprus, Van Zeiss suggests that the relative abundance of ryegrass grains makes one wonder why they may have served, if they may have served as human food. In that case, dehusking of the fruits must have been a very tedious and time-consuming task. For the time being, the question whether or not ryegrass was consumed by man-human must remain open. Marianne Murray highlights the point that others, including Zohari and Hoff and Butler, have made that the interpretation and the role of wild taxa in antiquity may be influenced by modern cultural perceptions of food and fodder. For example, grass pea, Lathyrus sativus, is today considered a primary food crop in some areas, but a main fodder crop in others, and as well as a last resort famine food in still other regions. This highlights the need to really question the uniquely high presence of Lolium in the samples of Cypriot prehistory, particularly in the island southwest. So Lolium in Cypriot prehistory, was it a weed, a food, a famine food, a nuisance, a death sentence, or something else? First, I would like to address it as a food resource. There are generally three main questions. The first is the question of consumption. I think the historical documents provide clear evidence that it was occasionally throughout history consumed intentionally, regardless or perhaps because of the special effects of fungus contamination. There is no doubt that it would have been ingested intentionally or unintentionally along with wheat grains in prehistory because of its ability to mimic wheat and sneak its way into our diets in the most sinister of ways. There is no doubt that it was consumed from early in the Neolithic. Recent evidence from the PPNA in the Central Zagros Mountains led Whitlam et al. 2018 to argue that it was a staple food and part of their plant management strategy. Second, we must address the issue of the fungus itself. Like I said, some species of Lolium are more prone to fungus than others, with Darnell or Temulentum having the highest susceptibility. The historical accounts tend to appear in temperate Europe with Lolium temulentum. So perhaps the prehistoric Mediterranean climatic conditions, along with the species present in Southwest Cyprus, did not favor the fungus growth. The third, was it actually cultivated in its own right? I think it is hard to argue against it as a potential cultivated species, or at least gathered resource based on the numbers of remains and the PPNA evidence from the Central Zagros. But what about the other arable weeds in the Southwest? Couldn't lolium just be a very successful weed of cultivation? Well, yes, it could, but it could be both at the same time. If you compare it to other similar sized arable weeds like wild avena or oat, it still stands out and it aligns more with other edible plants in the archaeological record. So if we go with lolium as a cultivated resource, how unique is it? And how would it explain the web associated with its processing and consumption? What does a cuisine including lolium as a staple crop look like? These are two biplots from correspondence analysis from my PhD. We have the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age on the left and the Neolithic on the right. I show these to illustrate how lolium is partly responsible for the regional separation between Cyprus and the surrounding regions. You can see in both biplots that lolium is the species that is pulling the Cypriot data from the rest of the sites in the broader region. For the rest of my time tonight, I would like to share some thoughts on the Southwest and how I think the archaeobotanical data contributes to interpretations of changes seen in culinary traditions during the Chalcolithic and specifically the Middle Chalcolithic. These are very preliminary results and not at all comprehensive, but I hope to show primarily the potential and the framework in understanding prehistoric foodways. And I'll be honest, it was very hard to pick which ones I wanted to highlight. So before wrapping it all up, I will first very broadly outline what has been described as the Neolithicity of Southwest Asian bread culture entanglement and the labor intensification post-harvest. Here we have a cultural preference for cereal-based foods, first baked into bread-like foods, then porridges when pottery arrives. So number one involves the collection, harvesting, pre-harvest intensification of cereals early in the Neolithic. And these included gloom wheats and barley, and very shortly after, bread wheats. The culturally preferred edible food was the glutinous flatbread. So efforts increased in the storing of cereals and the grinding of the cereals into a flour for baking. So before the bread can be baked, it needs to be ground. The baking requires the construction and maintenance of labor-intensive ovens. This is followed by dietary diversification with a preference for porridges cooked in pots as well, but we'll keep it simple for now and stick with the bread. All of this results in a lot of labor into processing of cereal grains and making that very special culturally preferred food and regionally distinct food. Essentially, glutinous cereal grains were the cultural push that justified the increased labor associated with all the other things attached to the web or human thing entanglement, and the agricultural practices to harvest the cereals, to the groundstone to process, and the ovens to bake. On the mainland, this happens all by the end of the PP&B, where ovens, loom, and bread wheats are ubiquitous. In the beginning of the Cypriot Southwest Neolithic, we have evidence of barley and gloom wheats, as well as flax and lentil. However, by the late PP&B, the samples are mostly gloom wheats and lolium, with a little bit of lentil, flax, terebinth, and fig. There doesn't appear to be very much investment in processing of cereals. During this period, we see minimal investment in baking cereal-based foodstuffs. If they were made, they were likely made with low investment hearths, and we do not have boiling pots, so processing of the lentils was likely done in a similar way. So I'd like to suggest that perhaps the culinary practices and cuisines of this period were not centered on the Southwest Asian bread. Perhaps the cuisine of gloom wheats and lolium rusks or mush wasn't motivation enough to increase labor and post-harvest processing or the materialesque associated with bread creation. For it is the highly glutinous cereals that really create the bubbles and allow the bread to rise, which obviously ovens increase. However, in the Southwest, it becomes a lot more interesting beginning in the Chalcolithic and even more so in the Middle Chalcolithic. Lentil appears to become more common from the early Chalcolithic, and it increases further from the Middle Chalcolithic. At the same time, we see diversification in pulse consumption as well, including pea, chickpea, and bitter vetch. I believe this ties to the appearance of cooking vessels or flat-bottomed trays and a new cultural preference for diverse foods beyond the roasted. We do see an increase in gluten wheats from the Middle Chalcolithic, as well as an increase in both barley and bread wheat. This corresponds to an increase in grain stores, as well as increasing emphasis on cereal cultivation with regard to the groundstone evidence. Another major change is the appearance of a variety of different hearths and ovens, including 4 Tanner-type ovens at Kissonerga-Skalia. This also corresponds, again, to a massive increase in bulk and liquid storage as well, with the potential olive press at the Pithos house at Kissonerga-Skalia being interpreted as a possible storage for olive oil or some other liquid. And I'd like to take it a little bit further with an inclusion of the evidence for lolium. What if the massive increase in lolium during the Middle Chalcolithic, along with increasing numbers of barley, are a result of beer production? Could some of the 3,200 liters of liquid storage at the Pithos house be allocated for this labor-intensive and precious commodity? Is beer one of the motivating factors for all the lines of evidence in support of labor intensification pre- and post-harvest? I raise the possibility that lolium was cultivated in the Cypriot Southwest Neolithic for cereal-based foods like rusks and mush, and with the Middle Chalcolithic diversification and expansion of cuisine and culinary practices, it went on beyond cereal-based foods to an accidental or an intentional inclusion in beer. Could a new species of lolium that thrives in fields of flax that was introduced in the Middle Chalcolithic increase the likelihood of fungal growth? Could the fungus have caused a change in the way lolium was perceived culturally, and the unsolicited effects of ergotism a motivation for beer production, a motivation to even increase the cultivation of barley? Crew and Hill make a convincing argument for the production of beer with evidence of a malting kiln at Kissonerga-Skalia. Could the culinary practices at Skalia be an evolution of a culinary tradition that began in the late Chalcolithic at Kissonerga-Skalia? There have been others that have proposed the possibility of beer production in the Chalcolithic as well, including Eddie Peltenberg in 1998 at Limba Lacus, period 3, and Frankel and Webb in 2008 for the early Bronze Age. Obviously, it is early days, but I hope it highlights the potential of integrating the archaeobotanical data and archaeological evidence for culinary traditions. To conclude, there are so many entanglements and so much potential in unraveling early prehistoric Cypriot cuisine and crop choice, as well as the culturally determined culinary traditions that they were associated with. I am currently unraveling the cuisine and culinary traditions by analyzing the food remains from Kissonerga-Skalia and Prastio-Mezorotsos. I believe these are the cultural artifacts that connect the two, and I'm excited to continue this effort and hope to publish the more comprehensive results early next year. But for now, I end with some preliminary results. And this is one potential food fragment of about 20 that illustrate how archaeobotany can inform culinary practices or traditions. To a trained eye, you can see fragments of cereal, not sure what species yet, maybe barley, maybe lolium, and cereal bran. This is surrounded by additional fragmented cereal-like material that has been processed and gelatinized through heat. It is too early to say if it is bread or rusk, but it is likely processed and cooked food since it contains both terebinth fragments alongside processed cereals, most likely compared to today's Termethopita. There we go. So there's a lot more work to be done in connecting the different lines of evidence, but I think contextualizing the relationship between plant use and culinary traditions is the first step in understanding the economic importance of cultivated plants, as well as their individual domestication histories, like lolium, flax, and chickpea. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Leilani. Let me see if I can manage to turn the lights on.